"We don't serve costume parties here. Try somewhere else." That's what pub owner James Fenley told Sergeant Lennox Ward before throwing him out into the London streets while still in his full Coldstream Guard's uniform. "If you want to play dress up," Fenley added with a sneer, "find a children's party." 24 hours later, 37 Royal Guards walked through his front door. What happened next left the entire pub speechless. But before we reveal how this quiet act of solidarity unfolded, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling us where in the world you're watching from now. Without further ado, let's get into it. The heavy wooden door of Fenley's public house swung open just after 10 on a Thursday evening. The warm glow of Edison bulbs cast long shadows across polished mahogany tables, and the gentle murmur of conversation filled the cosy space near Trafalgar Square. It was the kind of traditional London pub that prided itself on atmosphere, all brass fittings and hunting. Prince the sort of place where tourists paid premium prices to feel authentically. British Sergeant Lennox Ward stepped inside his polished boots, making barely a whisper on the worn wooden floors. At 39, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from 17 years of military service, 12 of those with the Coldstream Guards. His dark navy tunic was immaculate, despite the long day brass buttons gleaming under the amber light. The red plume from his bare skin was tucked neatly into his coat pocket. A small concession to being off-duty. Ward had been looking forward to this moment all day. After 14 hours of ceremonial duty at St. James's Palace, covering for a colleague hospitalized with pneumonia, he wanted nothing more than a quiet pint and 20 minutes to decompress. The pub had caught his eye during his morning commute. Its window advertised London's finest traditional ales in gold lettering that spoke of heritage and respect for tradition. There was something else too. His grandfather had mentioned this place once. Years ago, said he'd had his last drink here before shipping out to Normandy in 1944. Harold Ward. Royal Engineers never made it back. The old man's war stories had been what first drew young Lennox to military service, and the idea of sitting where his grandfather once sat felt like closing a circle that had been open too long. The conversation in the pub gradually died as patrons noticed his uniform. A middle-aged couple by the fireplace whispered to each other. The woman pointing discreetly, an elderly gentleman reading the Times over his shepherd's pie gave an approving nod. A young teacher grading papers looked up with genuine curiosity. Ward approached the bar where a thin man in his 30s was drying glasses with mechanical precision. The bartender's hands slowed, then stopped entirely as he took in the ceremonial uniform. "Evening," Ward said politely, his voice carrying just a hint of the Yorkshire accent he'd never quite lost. "Could I get a pint of London Pride, please?" Before the bartender could respond, a door marked private swung open. Out stepped a man in his early 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of narrow face that suggested he'd spent years practicing disapproval. His tailored waistcoat and crisp white shirt marked him as Management James Fenley. The man announced, though no one had asked, "I own this establishment." Ward nodded respectfully. "Pleasure to meet you." Sir Fenley's eyes swept over the uniform with undisguised disdain. The truth was, he'd been having problems with his upscale clientele. Lately, complaints about the pub becoming too touristy, too many people in fancy dress taking photos instead of spending real money. Last week, a group of street performers dressed as beefeaters had caused a scene demanding free drinks in exchange. For entertaining his customers, he'd thrown them out, and his regular customers had applauded. This looked like more of the same. "I'm afraid we have a dress code here. This isn't a fancy dress party, I'm sorry." Ward's brow furrowed slightly. "The costume," Fenley clarified, gesturing dismissively at the ceremonial tunic. "Very impressive, I'm sure, but we cater to a professional clientele, not theatre groups." Ward's voice remained perfectly level. "This isn't a costume, sir. I'm Sergeant Ward, Coldstream Guards. I've just finished duty and was hoping for a quiet drink." Fenley's laugh was sharp and humorless cold. "Stream Guards, really, and I suppose you've just popped over from Buckingham Palace." "St. James's Palace, actually," Ward replied without defensiveness. "I was covering the additional shift for a colleague who's in hospital." The murmur of conversation around the pub had ceased entirely. All eyes were on the exchange. though most patrons seemed more embarrassed by Fenley's behavior than impressed by it. "Look!" Fenley continued, his voice carrying across the now silent room. "I don't know what sort of establishment you think this is, but we don't serve people in fancy dress. There are plenty of tourist pubs in Leicester Square that would love your performance." Ward stood perfectly still, his military bearing evident even in civilian company. "I assure you, Mr. Fenley, I'm simply a soldier looking for a drink after a long day." Soldier Fenley scoffed. Soldiers wear combat gear, not parade costumes. "This is what? Some sort of reenactment hobby, Civil War enthusiast." Are we? The elderly gentleman by the fireplace sat down his newspaper with audible disapproval. "Young man, that's clearly an authentic uniform. Show some respect." Fenley rounded on him. "Respect for what? Anyone can rent these costumes. Half the buskers around Westminster dress like this." Ward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm. "Sir, I've served 3 tours in Afghanistan, wearing this regiment's combat uniform. This ceremonial dress represents Afghanistan." Fenley interrupted with mock concern. How terrifying that must have been, standing outside the palace, waving at tourists. The pub had fallen completely silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Even the bartender had stopped pretending to work, staring at his employer with obvious discomfort. Ward tried once more. "Mr. Fenley, I understand there may be confusion, but I can assure you what I can assure you." Fenley cut him off. "Is that people who dress up for attention aren't welcome in my establishment. We serve real professionals here. Bankers, solicitors, people with actual jobs, not street performers looking for tips." The young teacher closed her marking book with a snap. "This is absolutely disgraceful," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. Fenley ignored her, focusing entirely on Ward. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, and next time you want to play soldier, try the comic book shop down the road." Ward stood, motionless for several seconds, his expression unreadable. Then, with the same precision he brought to every military maneuver, he gave a slight nod. "Understood, sir." He turned toward the door with measured steps, his posture straight and dignified. Despite the humiliation as he reached for the brass handle, the young teacher stood up. "Wait," she called out. "You don't have to leave. This is Ward." Paused and looked back at her with a small, appreciative smile. "It's quite all right, miss. Some battles aren't worth fighting." As the door closed behind him, the pub erupted in scattered conversation. The elderly gentleman shook his head in disgust. The teacher gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. Even the bartender was openly shaking his head at his employer. Fenley surveyed the room with satisfaction. "Right then, can we get back to enjoying our evening?" But the atmosphere had changed. The warm, convivial mood had been replaced by an uncomfortable tension that even the finest ales couldn't wash away outside in the London night. Sergeant Lennox Ward walked with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained inside. He didn't look back at the pub's warm windows or dwell on the injustice of the encounter. Instead, he focused on the familiar rhythm of his footsteps on the pavement, carrying him home through streets he'd sworn to protect. The fluorescent lights in the Wellington Barracks corridor buzzed quietly as Sergeant Ward pushed through the heavy doors. Just before midnight, the hallway was mostly empty. Just the echo of his polished boots on the worn linoleum and the distant hum of conversation from the recreation room ward made his way toward the locker room, passing the regimental photographs that lined the walls, images of ceremonies, deployments, and the proud history of the Coldstream Guard stretching back centuries. Tonight, those pictures felt heavier. Somehow, Private Charlie Menzies was sitting on one of the benches, cleaning his rifle with the methodical precision drilled into every guardsman he looked up as Ward entered, noting immediately that something was off in his sergeant's usually impeccable demeanor. "All right, Sarge?" Charlie asked, setting down his cleaning rod. Ward opened his locker and began removing his tunic with careful, practiced movements. "Went for a pint after duty, didn't go quite as planned." Charlie waited. He'd learned that Sergeant Ward wasn't one for unnecessary words, but when he chose to speak, it was worth listening. "Owner of the place near Trafalgar told me the uniform wasn't welcome." Ward continued, hanging his tunic with the same precision he brought to everything. "Said it was a costume. Called me a street performer." Charlie's hands stilled on his rifle. You're having a laugh. Ward's expression answered the question before he spoke. Threw me out in front of a full pub, said. Soldiers wear combat gear, not parade costumes. The locker. Room door opened, and Lance Corporal Patel entered with Privates Mercer and Davidson, all in various stages of changing out of their uniforms. The conversation died as they sensed the tension. What's happened? Patel asked. Noting Charlie's expression, Charlie looked at Ward, who simply continued folding his uniform. Tell them, Sarge. Ward sighed quietly. Fenley's public house owner decided. The ceremonial uniform was inappropriate for his colonel made it clear that people like us weren't welcome. Davidson, barely 21 and still carrying the enthusiasm of a new recruit. Bristled people like us. What's that supposed to mean? Apparently we're not real professionals, Ward replied without bitterness. Just street performers playing dress up. The room fell silent, except for the steady tick of the wall clock. These men had stood guard in driving rain, blazing heat, and bitter cold they'd served. In combat zones, lost friends to enemy fire and dedicated their lives to service. The idea that their uniform, their pride, could be dismissed as a costume struck at something fundamental. Patel was the first to break the silence. Did you report it? Ward shook his head. To who man has the right to refuse service in his own establishment? Not like that, he doesn't, Mercer said quietly. Not to one of us, not in that uniform. Charlie pulled out his phone, his thumbs moving across the screen. What's the place called again? Fenley's Ward replied. But Charlie. Nah, Sarge, this isn't right. Charlie opened the unit's WhatsApp group, an informal network that connected the entire company across different rotations and duties. His message was simple, but effective. Sarge got kicked out of Fenley's pub near Trafalgar. Owner called the ceremonial uniform. A costume said, We're not real professionals. Anyone fancy a pint tomorrow? No full dress. The response was immediate within minutes. The thread filled with replies. Count me in, Corporal Williams, absolutely. Private Jones on my way, Sergeant Brooks, full kit. Lance, Corporal Smith, full kit. Charlie's response, more messages flooded in guards, who'd served with Ward in Afghanistan. Men he'd trained when they were fresh recruits. Veterans who'd stood beside him during the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, through torrential rain and searing heat. They didn't need details about what had happened. The fact that it had happened to Ward was enough. Sergeant Hayes, who'd served 2 tours with Ward in Helmand Province, typed, Remember when Sarge carried Johnson 3 miles with a broken leg, we carry him now. Private Thompson, barely 19, added, My mum always said to respect the uniform time someone learned why. By morning, 37 members of the Coldstream Guards had confirmed their attendance. No one asked for details. No one questioned the plan. They simply understood that when one of their own was disrespected, while wearing the uniform, they all honoured. Silence wasn't an option. Ward watched the messages accumulate, with a mixture of concern and deep gratitude. You don't have to do this. Yes, we do, Patel said firmly. It's not about you, Sarge. It's about what that uniform means. Charlie nodded. Every time we put it on, we represent everyone who's worn it before us. Can't let that be treated like a carnival costume. As Ward prepared for bed, he reflected. On the evening's events, he'd been humiliated, certainly, but he'd also witnessed something remarkable. The quiet solidarity of men who understood that respect wasn't given freely, but earned through service, and sometimes defended through presence. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, Sergeant Lennox Ward fell asleep, knowing he wouldn't face them alone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Wellington Barracks as 37 members of the Coldstream Guards prepared for an unusual deployment. Unlike their typical ceremonial duties, this operation had been organised entirely through WhatsApp messages and quiet conversations in corridor. Corners Sergeant Major Harrison, a career soldier with 25 years of service, had caught wind of the plan during the morning inspection. Rather than shut it down, he'd simply nodded and made a note in the duty roster that several guards were taking. Personal time for community relations. By 11:30, the group had assembled in the main courtyard. They weren't in formation, This wasn't an official military operation, but their bearing was unmistakably martial. Each man wore the full ceremonial uniform, scarlet tunic, dark navy trousers with red stripe-polished boots that reflected the morning light, and the iconic bearskin cap. Private Menzies had coordinated the logistics with military efficiency. "We're not protesting," he reminded the group. "We're not making speeches. We're just having a drink at a pub that serves the public." Sergeant Ward stood slightly apart from the group, still uncomfortable with the attention. These men had volunteered their free time to support him, and the weight of that gesture wasn't lost on him. "You sure about this?" he asked Charlie quietly. "Said you stood 14 hours in the heat because Jenkins was in hospital. You've covered extra shifts for half the lads here at some point. This is what mates do." At precisely 11:45, they began the short march to Fenley's public house. They didn't march in formation. That would have been too official, too confrontational. Instead, they walked in small groups, converging on the pub from different directions. Like pieces of a carefully orchestrated plan, James Fenley arrived at his pub just before opening time keys, jingling as he approached the front door. The morning delivery had gone smoothly, and he was looking forward to a profitable lunch service. The location near Trafalgar Square guaranteed a steady stream of tourists willing to pay premium prices for an authentic British pub experience. He was sorting through invoices behind the bar when young Ella, his newest waitress, arrived for her shift. She'd been working at the pub for only 3 weeks, but she was reliable and had a good way with the customers. More importantly, she'd been the only staff member the night before who'd looked uncomfortable when Ward was ejected. "Morning, Mr. Fenley," she said, hanging up her coat. "Busy day ahead." "Thursday lunch usually is," he replied without looking up. "Tourists love the traditional atmosphere." Ella began her opening routine, wiping down tables, checking the condiment bottles, ensuring everything was perfect for the day's service. She was polishing the brass rail along the bar when she noticed something outside. At first it was just one figure in a red tunic, then 2. Then she stopped counting. "Mr. Fenley," she said slowly, "you might want to see this." "What is it outside? There are people," Fenley asked irritably. From the window, he could see hundreds of men in Royal Guard uniforms standing along the pavement with calculated precision. They weren't blocking the entrance or holding signs. Rather, they were simply there, a sea of scarlet tunics and towering bear skin caps that drew the attention of every passerby. The sight was both beautiful and frightening in equal measure. These were real soldiers, not the street artists Fenley had imagined the night before, and their demeanour made that abundantly clear. They stood with the same quiet authority that they brought to their duties at the palace, but there was something different about seeing so many of them together. It wasn't exactly intimidation, but it was presence. The kind of presence that reminded you that these men had sworn oaths, carried weapons, and were prepared to die for what they believed in. "What the hell is this?" Fenley murmured as he watched. More guards from side streets take their positions among the others. Some tourists had begun snapping photos, clearly mistaking this for some sort of official ceremony, while others had stopped to observe, whispering amongst themselves. The guards stood silently, not making any demands, but simply standing there with the quiet dignity that had made them symbols of British tradition for centuries. Then, Sergeant Lennox Ward walked into the pub from the street. He was still wearing the same uniform that had been referred to as a costume the night before. Behind him were Charlie Menzies, Patel, and Davidson. One by one, the guards entered the pub with measured steps and impeccable bearing. Fenley remained motionless behind. The bar as his establishment was filled with the very people he had dismissed as street artists. Each man found a seat, some at tables and others at the bar, and none of them spoke above a quiet murmur. None of them made a scene or demanded service. They simply existed in his space with the same quiet authority that they brought to their duties at the palace. Ella watched in fascination as the pub transformed. The typical lunchtime chaos was replaced by an almost reverent quiet. Even the tourists who wandered in seemed to sense that something significant was happening, instinctively lowering their voices. Ward sat with the same perfect posture that came from years of military discipline at the same corner table he had been denied the night before. He removed his bear skin cap and carefully placed it on the bench beside him. Good afternoon, sir. What can I get for you? Ella asked, her tone respectful. A pint of London Pride, please, Ward replied with a slight smile. Thank you. Fenley was standing still, his face pale, as Ella went back to the bar to pour his beer. He seemed utterly lost and speechless from the previous night's arrogance. Mr. Fenley, she murmured, what should I do? He didn't respond. Instead, he was fixated on the room full of guards, each of whom was a live reminder of his error. These weren't street performers or costume enthusiasts. Rather, they were real soldiers who had earned the right to wear those uniforms through commitment, service, and sacrifice. Ella placed Ward's pint on the table and then leaned in to say, I was here last night, and I saw what happened. I'm sorry. Thank you, miss, but you have nothing to apologize for, Ward said politely. Other guards were ordering beverages and engaging in quiet conversation around the pub. Their presence had drawn additional customers, locals who had heard about the unusual meeting, and tourists attracted by the sight of so many ceremonial uniforms in one location. But there was no show, no performance, just men having drinks after a hard morning's work, exactly as they had every right to do. At last, Fenley found his voice, and he approached the table, his earlier arrogance replaced by obvious discomfort. Sergeant, he began, then paused, unsure of what to say. Ward raised his head expectantly, but his face was blank. Last night, Fenley struggled with the words. I made an error in judgment. Fenley went on, his voice barely audible above the hushed chatter around them. I didn't understand. I thought I assumed you assumed we weren't real. The uniform is a costume. We are dressing up to get people's attention. Fenley's face replied. Silently, yes, I was mistaken about these guys, Ward said softly. Ward pointed around the space, noting that the uniform was earned through years of service and sacrifice, that they have served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Northern Ireland, and that they have stood watch in blizzards and heat waves. Apology accepted, Ward said simply. As the tension in the room appeared to dissipate all at once, the bar began to resemble what it should be, a place where people may gather in mutual respect, and the conversations resumed as other customers became aware of. The exchange. First round for the guards is on the house, Fenley whispered to Ella, who was obviously inquisitive. And from now on, anyone wearing that uniform drinks free. Something amazing occurred throughout the afternoon. Rather than returning to normal, the pub became better. The guards' presence had drawn in respectful customers who understood the importance of what they had seen. Conversations were quieter and more courteous, and even the tourists seemed to realize that they were in the presence of something special. Word had somehow spread via social media, whispered conversations, and the mysterious ways in which significant moments ripple outward. By 3 hours, there was a queue outside the pub, not of gawkers or thrill-seekers, but of people who wanted to buy a drink for a guard, shake a hand, say thank you, veterans who had heard the story and wanted to show solidarity, and even a few police, officers who had come in during their break, nodding respectfully to men who understood what it meant to serve. Fenley watched it all with growing amazement. His pub had never been so full, so alive with genuine respect and camaraderie. These weren't customers. They were a community brought together by the simple act of honouring those who served. The till was ringing continuously, but for the first time in years, he was hardly aware of the money. He was watching something more valuable than profit, the restoration of dignity, both given and received when the guards finally began to leave. They did so as they'd arrived quietly, without fanfare. Each man nodded respectfully to Fenley as he passed a gesture that seemed to shrink the pub owner. With its generosity, some shook hands with the other customers, others simply touched their caps in acknowledgement. The youngest guard, barely 20, paused to thank Ella for her kindness, leaving her beaming with pride. Ward was the last to go, he finished. His pint left payment on the table despite Fenley's offer and stood to leave. Sergeant, Fenley called out. Ward turned back. Will you? Would you consider coming back as a regular customer? I mean, you're always welcome here. Ward considered the question seriously. I might, at that, Mr. Fenley. It's a lovely pub, when it's run properly, as the door closed behind him. Ella began clearing the empty glasses. She found that Fenley hadn't moved from behind the bar, staring at the door with an expression she'd never seen before. "You all right, Mr. Fenley?" He nodded slowly. "Better than I've been. In years, I think outside the guards dispersed as quietly as they'd assembled. No one made speeches or demanded recognition. They'd made their point through presence alone, a reminder that respect isn't given freely, but it should be given fairly." The next evening, Sergeant Ward returned to Fenley's public house. He wore civilian clothes this time, jeans and a jumper, looking like any other customer seeking a quiet pint. After work, Fenley greeted him personally, his manner completely transformed. From their first encounter, Sergeant Ward, "Please sit wherever you like." Ward chose the same corner table, more out of habit than symbolism, when Ella brought his drink. She lingered for a moment. "It's different now," she said quietly. "The whole atmosphere. People are more respectful." Ward nodded. "Sometimes people just need reminding of what respect looks like." An elderly gentleman at the next table leaned over. "Excuse me, but weren't you here yesterday with all those other guards?" "I was," Ward replied. "Magnificent sight," the man said. "Haven't seen anything like it since the war. My father would have approved." He was army himself, as Ward enjoyed his drink in peace. He reflected on the events of the past 24 hours. He'd been humiliated, supported, and ultimately vindicated, but the real victory wasn't personal. It was the reminder that the uniform he wore represented something larger than himself, a tradition of service that deserved respect. Not because it demanded it, but because it had earned it. The pub had changed too. Where once there had been casual arrogance, now there was genuine hospitality. Where there had been assumptions and prejudice, now there was recognition and respect. And sometimes Ward thought, as he finished his pint, that was enough. Sometimes a quiet victory was the most powerful kind of all. As he prepared to leave, Fenley approached his table one more time. "Sergeant, I hope you don't mind my asking, but what made you come back after what I said?" "What I did," Ward considered the question carefully. "Because this is what we do, Mr. Fenley. We serve, we protect, and sometimes we forgive. It's all part of the same duty." He left the pub that night, knowing he'd found not just a place to drink, but a place where the uniform. Have you ever been judged by your appearance before someone knew your tale? How did you handle the situation when respect had to be earned rather than given? The simple act of showing up and the silent dignity with which he carried himself would always be welcome. And in a world that sometimes forgets the value of service and sacrifice, that was no small thing. Sergeant Ward and his fellow guards demonstrated that respect is not demanded, it is shown. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. Share this with someone who understands that true strength sometimes comes from restraint, and that the most meaningful victories are often the quietest ones. Check out our other incredible stories appearing on your screen now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another tale of honor, dignity, and the quiet heroism of those who serve.